50 phrases, 5 groups, every one of them for part 3 of the IELTS speaking exam. In this video, I am giving you the complete toolkit for part 3 discussion, organized not by topic, but by function. Because the examiner does not care which topic you are discussing, they care how you discuss it. Group 1, opinion openers. How to begin your answer in a way that signals Band 8 thinking from the very first sentence. Group 2, nuance and qualification. How to complicate your own position in ways that sound like genuine thinking rather than hedging. Group 3, developing and extending. How to build on your initial point rather than repeating it. Group 4, evaluating and concluding. How to end a part 3 answer with genuine thought rather than a summary. Group 5, handling difficult questions. The phrases that save you when the question is unexpected, ambiguous, or simply hard. Every phrase comes with the contrast, what Band 5 sounds like on the same idea, and a note on exactly when and how to use it. Let us start. Section 1 is opinion openers. The first sentence of your Part 3 answer is the most important. These 10 phrases open your opinion in a way that immediately signals Band 8 thinking: analytical, honest, and direct. Phrase 1. I find this genuinely complex. There are compelling arguments on both sides. Use when. Opening any Part 3 question where a simple yes or no would oversimplify the issue. Instead of saying, I think technology is good, say this: I find this genuinely complex. The benefits are real, but so are the costs, and I am not sure we have fully reckoned with either. The word genuinely adds weight. Complex signals depth. This opener immediately tells the examiner you are about to give a considered answer, not a rehearsed one. Phrase 2. My instinct is to say yes, though with some important qualifications. Use when. Giving a provisional position before introducing nuance. Instead of saying, yes, I agree with this, say this: my instinct is to say yes, though with some important qualifications that I think change the picture considerably. Instinct is a natural-sounding word for gut reaction. The qualifications promise that something interesting is coming. Use this whenever you have a position, but want to signal immediately that you are also going to complicate it. Phrase 3. On balance, I lean towards the view that, though I hold it with some uncertainty. Use when. Giving a weighted opinion on a genuinely contested question. Instead of saying, I think people are less happy now, say this: on balance, I lean towards the view that modern life has made certain kinds of happiness harder, though I hold that view with some uncertainty. On balance signals that you have weighed the evidence. Lean towards is more sophisticated than think or believe. I hold it with some uncertainty is honest and sounds completely natural. Phrase 4. I would push back slightly on the premise of that question. Use when. When the question contains an assumption you want to challenge before answering. Instead of saying, yes, I agree, say this: I would push back slightly on the premise, because the question assumes that tradition and progress are necessarily in opposition, and I am not sure they are. This is one of the most powerful moves available in Part 3. Challenging the premise shows analytical independence. Use it sparingly, once or twice per exam, for maximum effect. Phrase 5. What strikes me most about this issue is not the obvious dimension, but the less visible one. Use when. When you want to redirect the discussion to a more interesting or less discussed aspect. Instead of saying, the main problem with social media is that it wastes time, say this: what strikes me most about this issue is not the time dimension, which is well documented, but the effect on the quality of attention people bring to everything else. Not the obvious dimension, but the less visible one, immediately signals original thinking. You are telling the examiner you have noticed something that most people miss. Phrase 6. I am somewhat skeptical of that idea, and here is why. Use when, expressing measured disagreement without sounding dismissive. Instead of saying, I disagree with that, say this: I am somewhat skeptical of that idea, not because the intention behind it is wrong, but because the evidence for it is weaker than it is usually presented. Somewhat skeptical is more sophisticated than disagree, and here is why signals that the disagreement is principled rather than emotional. The reasoning that follows will be taken more seriously. Phrase 7. The more I think about this, the more I believe that the real issue is actually elsewhere. Use when redirecting a discussion to what you consider the more fundamental problem. Instead of saying, the problem is that people do not exercise enough, say this. The more I think about this, the more I believe the real issue is not behavior, but the conditions that make healthy behavior genuinely difficult for most people. This structure, the more I think, the more I believe, sounds like live thinking rather than a prepared answer. The real issue is actually elsewhere is a confident redirect that elevates the analytical level immediately. Phrase 8. I think reasonable people genuinely disagree on this, and I want to acknowledge that before giving my own view. Use when you want to signal intellectual honesty about a genuinely contested question. Instead of saying, there are two sides to this argument, say this. I think reasonable people genuinely disagree on this. The trade-offs are real, and the values at stake are ones that different people weigh differently. With that acknowledged, my own view is, acknowledging genuine disagreement before stating your position makes your position more credible, not less. It signals that you have considered other views rather than simply asserting your own. Phrase 9. This is one of those questions where I think the honest answer is more complicated than it might appear. Use when signaling that you are about to give a genuinely nuanced answer rather than a simple one. Instead of saying, it is a difficult question, say this. This is one of those questions where I think the honest answer is more complicated than it might appear, and I want to try to do it justice rather than give a neat response. I want to try to do it justice sounds like genuine intellectual commitment. It is the kind of phrase that makes an examiner sit forward slightly. It promises that something thoughtful is coming. Phrase 10. I hold a fairly strong view on this, which might be worth stating up front. Use when. When you have a clear position and want to signal it confidently before developing it. Instead of saying, I think this is very important, say this. I hold a fairly strong view on this, which might be worth stating up front. I think the way we currently approach this question is fundamentally mistaken, and here is why. Fairly strong is more credible than very strong. Worth stating up front signals confidence and directness. Use this when you genuinely have a clear position. It sets up the development of your argument well. Now let's see. Group 2. Adding nuance and qualification. Phrase 11. That said, and this is an important qualification, use when introducing a significant counterpoint after an initial position. Instead of saying, but there are also disadvantages, say this. That said, and this is an important qualification, the evidence for this is considerably less robust than it is usually presented. That said is one of the most natural transition phrases in English. Adding, and this is an important qualification, signals to the examiner that what follows is not just a token counterpoint, but something that genuinely complicates the picture. Phrase 12. Both things can be true simultaneously, and I think that is part of what makes this difficult. Use when holding two seemingly contradictory positions without forcing a resolution. Instead of saying, so there are good and bad sides, say this. Both things can be true simultaneously. Cities can be more connected and more lonely at the same time. And I think that is part of what makes this question genuinely difficult to resolve. Refusing to resolve a genuine tension is more sophisticated than forcing a conclusion. This phrase tells the examiner you are comfortable with complexity, which is itself a marker of high-level thinking. Phrase 13. The picture is considerably more nuanced than it is usually presented. Use when challenging an oversimplified public narrative about a topic. Instead of saying, it is not that simple, say this. The picture is considerably more nuanced than it is usually presented, because most discussions of this topic focus on the most visible dimension while ignoring the structural one. Considerably more nuanced is more precise than not that simple. Usually presented invites the examiner to think about who is presenting this narrative and why. It positions you as someone thinking critically rather than just reporting. Phrase 14. I would not want to overstate the case, but the evidence does point in a fairly clear direction. Use when making a confident claim while hedging against overstating it. Instead of saying, "This is definitely true," say this: "I would not want to overstate the case. There are legitimate counterarguments, but the evidence does point in a fairly clear direction, and I think it deserves to be taken seriously." I would not want to overstate the case is intellectual modesty that actually strengthens the claim that follows. It signals that you have considered the limits of the evidence, which makes the claim more credible, not less. Phrase 15. It depends quite heavily on what you mean by, and that distinction matters. Use when a key term in the question is ambiguous and the answer changes depending on how it is defined. Instead of saying, "It depends on the situation," say this: "It depends quite heavily on what you mean by success, because if you mean financial security, the answer is very different from if you mean fulfillment, and that distinction matters considerably." Asking what you mean by a key term signals analytical precision. The distinction matters shows the examiner that you are not just filling time, you are identifying something that genuinely changes the answer. Phrase 16. Not entirely for the better, though I want to be careful about nostalgia here. Use when acknowledging negative change while guarding against an uncritical preference for the past. Instead of saying, "Things have changed a lot and not always for the good," say this: "Social media has changed communication, not entirely for the better. Though I want to be careful about nostalgia here because the past was not straightforwardly better either." Not entirely for the better is more precise than saying there are disadvantages. The nostalgia caveat shows the examiner you are aware of the risks of a conservative position, which makes the critical observation more credible. Phrase 17. The benefits are real, but so are the costs, and I think we are sometimes slow to acknowledge the second. Use when giving balanced credit to both sides while signaling which you think is under-acknowledged. Instead of saying, "There are advantages and disadvantages," say this: "The benefits of globalization are real and significant, but so are the costs, and I think we are sometimes slow to acknowledge the second with the same honesty we apply to the first." This structure, "the benefits are real, but so are the costs," is more sophisticated than simply listing two sides. The observation that we are slow to acknowledge the costs positions you as someone with a genuine perspective rather than just a balanced template. Phrase 18. I think the honest answer involves acknowledging something uncomfortable. Use when you are about to make a point that goes against a popular or expected position. Instead of saying, "It is a sensitive topic," say this: "I think the honest answer involves acknowledging something uncomfortable, which is that the problem is not primarily about individual behavior, but about the systems that shape it." The honest answer involves acknowledging something uncomfortable is a high-value setup phrase. It signals that you are not going to give the safe answer, and examiners respond well to intellectual courage when it is backed by a well-reasoned position. Phrase 19. Whether that is a net positive or net negative is genuinely difficult to say. Use when concluding a discussion of a complex change without forcing a verdict you do not hold. Instead of saying, "So overall, I think it is more positive," say this: "Whether that is a net positive or net negative is genuinely difficult to say with confidence, and I think anyone who claims certainty is probably not engaging fully with the complexity." Refusing to give a verdict you do not hold is more impressive than a forced conclusion. Anyone who claims certainty is probably not engaging fully signals strong analytical awareness without being dismissive of those who disagree. Phrase 20. I suspect the full picture is somewhere between those two positions. Use when offering a synthesis when a question presents two extremes. Instead of saying, "I think the truth is somewhere in the middle," say this: "I suspect the full picture is somewhere between those two positions, and the more interesting question is why we tend to discuss it in binary terms when the reality is more continuous." I suspect is more natural than I think. The full picture is more precise than the truth. And the observation about binary framing elevates the answer from a synthesis to a genuine analytical point. Now, let's move on to the next section, which is developing and extending phrase 21. What I mean by that, and it is worth being precise here, is use when clarifying or deepening a point you have just made. Instead of saying, I mean, it is just not fair, say this. What I mean by that, and it is worth being precise here, is not that the system is unfair in intent, but that it produces unfair outcomes regardless of intent, which I think is the more important observation. It is worth being precise here signals intellectual care. The clarification that follows should always go one level deeper than the original point, not just restate it in different words. Phrase 22. And I think that point is actually more significant than it might initially appear. Use when flagging that you are about to develop a point that could be underestimated. Instead of saying, and that is also important, say this. The erosion of shared media is, I think, more significant than it might initially appear, because it is not just about where people get their news, but about whether they share any common factual ground at all. More significant than it might initially appear invites the examiner to reassess something. It promises a development rather than just a continuation. Use it when you genuinely have something additional to say about a point rather than just repeating it. Phrase 23. To make that concrete, a specific example would be use when grounding an abstract observation in a specific case. Instead of saying, for example, technology, say this. To make that concrete, a specific example would be the way that algorithmic recommendation systems create feedback loops that amplify existing beliefs rather than challenging them. To make that concrete is more sophisticated than, for example. It signals that you are moving deliberately from the abstract to the specific, a move the examiner can follow and appreciate. Phrase 24. And this has implications that go considerably beyond the surface issue. Use when signaling that the consequences of a point are wider than they first appear. Instead of saying, and this affects many areas, say this. And this has implications that go considerably beyond the surface issue. It affects not just individual behavior, but the social infrastructure that makes collective decision-making possible. Implications that go beyond the surface issue promises analytical depth. Considerably beyond is more precise than just beyond. Use this when a point you have made has knock-on effects worth developing. Phrase 25. The reason this matters is not just, it is more fundamentally about. Use when reframing a practical concern as a deeper structural or philosophical issue. Instead of saying, this matters because it is very important, say this. The reason this matters is not just economic. It is more fundamentally about what kind of society we want to live in and what we are willing to sacrifice for efficiency. Not just X, more fundamentally about Y, is one of the most reliable structures for elevating a Part 3 answer. It moves from the surface concern to the underlying value or principle, which is exactly where Band 8 discussion operates. Phrase 26. I think there is a less visible dimension to this that is worth drawing out. Use when introducing an aspect of a topic that is under-acknowledged in mainstream discussion. Instead of saying, there is also another point, say this. I think there is a less visible dimension to this that is worth drawing out, which is the way that the framing of the debate itself shapes which solutions seem possible. Less visible dimension signals original thinking. Worth drawing out signals intellectual purpose. This phrase works best when you genuinely have an observation that goes beyond what has already been said. Phrase 27. What tends to get lost in this discussion is use when identifying something important that the mainstream debate overlooks. Instead of saying, people do not talk enough about, say this. What tends to get lost in this discussion is the perspective of the people most directly affected, who are rarely the ones shaping the policy conversation. What tends to get lost is a sophisticated critical move. It positions you as someone who has thought about the gaps in the conventional debate rather than just summarizing it. Use it for a point you genuinely believe is underemphasized. Phrase 28. And if you follow that logic to its conclusion, you arrive at something quite interesting. Use when developing a line of reasoning to its natural endpoint. Instead of saying, so this shows that, say this. And if you follow that logic to its conclusion, you arrive at something quite interesting, which is that the solution might require changing the incentives rather than changing the behavior. Follow that logic to its conclusion sounds like genuine analytical process. Quite interesting is understated in a way that works. It invites the examiner to be curious about what comes next rather than announcing it. Phrase 29. The counter-argument, and I think it is worth taking seriously, would be that use when engaging honestly with the strongest version of the opposing view. Instead of saying, some people think differently, say this. The counter-argument, and I think it is worth taking seriously, would be that individual behavior matters even within constraining systems, and that agency should not be discounted entirely. Worth taking seriously signals genuine intellectual engagement rather than a token acknowledgement. Taking the strongest version of the counter-argument and then responding to it is the structure that most consistently produces Band 8 Part 3 answers. Phrase 30. And what that reveals, I think, is something quite fundamental about how we approach this question. Use when drawing a broader conclusion from a specific observation. Instead of saying, so this shows that it is complicated, say this. And what that reveals, I think, is something quite fundamental about how we approach this question. We tend to look for technical solutions to what are essentially political problems. What that reveals is fundamental is a strong evaluative phrase. It signals that you have extracted a general principle from a specific case, which is exactly the analytical move that Part 3 rewards most consistently. Next section is evaluating and concluding. Phrase 31. And that, I think, is the point that tends to get overlooked. Use when closing an answer by identifying the most important and under-acknowledged dimension. Instead of saying, so that is my answer, say this. And that, the effect on how people think rather than just what they think, is, I believe, the point that tends to get overlooked in most discussions of this topic. That is the point that tends to get overlooked is a strong closing move. It positions your final observation as the most important one while implicitly suggesting that other discussions have been incomplete. Phrase 32. Whether or not that is the right conclusion, I think it is the honest one. Use when ending with intellectual modesty that actually strengthens the position. Instead of saying, so I think this is the correct answer, say this. Whether or not that is the right conclusion, and I hold it with some uncertainty, I think it is the honest one given the evidence available. Distinguishing between the right conclusion and the honest one is a genuinely sophisticated move. It acknowledges that you might be wrong while committing to intellectual integrity. Examiners respond very well to this. Phrase 33. I suspect this is one of those questions that does not have a clean answer, and I think that is worth acknowledging. Use when resisting the pressure to resolve genuine complexity with a false conclusion. Instead of saying, so overall it is difficult to say this. I suspect this is one of those questions that does not have a clean answer, and I think acknowledging that is more intellectually honest than forcing a conclusion I do not actually hold. Resisting a false conclusion is itself an analytical act. More intellectually honest than forcing a conclusion I do not actually hold signals that your answer is genuine rather than performed, which is exactly what examiners value. Phrase 34. The question I would leave with, and I do not have a certain answer, is use when closing by identifying the deeper unresolved question that the discussion has raised. Instead of saying, so in conclusion, say this. The question I would leave with, and I genuinely do not have a certain answer, is whether we can change behavior without changing the incentive structures that produce it. Ending with a question is an advanced rhetorical move. It signals that you have thought beyond the immediate answer to what it implies. The admission that you do not have a certain answer makes it feel like genuine thinking rather than a rhetorical device. Phrase 35. What I find genuinely interesting about this question is that the closer you look, the more complicated it becomes. Use when reflecting on the nature of the question itself as a closing observation. Instead of saying, "It is a very interesting topic," say this: "What I find genuinely interesting about this question is that the closer you look, the more complicated it becomes," which suggests either that we are asking the wrong question or that there is no simple answer to the right one. The closer you look, the more complicated it becomes is a genuine analytical observation about the nature of complex problems. The either/or at the end adds a further layer of analytical precision. Phrase 36. I think the most defensible position is probably somewhere in the middle, but not as a compromise. Use when offering a synthesis while refusing to make it sound like fence-sitting. Instead of saying, "I think both sides have good points," say this: "I think the most defensible position is somewhere between those two extremes, but not as a compromise. More as a recognition that each captures something real that the other misses." Not as a compromise, but as a recognition is what distinguishes this from fence-sitting. It signals that the middle position is reached through analysis rather than through the desire to avoid commitment. Phrase 37. And I think that observation has implications well beyond the specific question you asked. Use when flagging that the conclusion applies more broadly than the immediate topic. Instead of saying, "And this is true for many things," say this: "And I think that observation, that the way we frame a problem determines which solutions seem possible, has implications well beyond this specific question." Well beyond this specific question elevates the discussion from the particular to the general. It signals that you have identified a principle rather than just answered a question, which is the highest level of Part 3 thinking. Phrase 38. What I would say with more confidence is that the question itself deserves more serious attention than it typically receives. Use when closing by arguing for the importance of the question rather than claiming certainty about the answer. Instead of saying, "So it is a very important topic," say this: "What I would say with more confidence than any specific conclusion is that this question deserves more serious and honest attention than it typically receives in public discussion." More serious and honest attention than it typically receives in public discussion positions you as a genuinely engaged thinker. It is a closing line that sounds like it comes from conviction rather than exam preparation. Phrase 39. The honest answer is that I do not know, but I think I know which way the evidence leans. Use when distinguishing between certainty and direction when you cannot claim the former. Instead of saying, "I'm not sure about this," say this: "The honest answer is that I do not know with confidence, but I think I know which way the evidence leans, and that is probably the most I can honestly claim." Distinguishing between knowing and knowing which way the evidence leans is intellectually precise in a way that simply saying, "I am not sure," is not. It demonstrates familiarity with evidence and epistemic honesty simultaneously. Phrase 40. It is one of those questions that I find myself returning to, which is perhaps its own kind of answer. Use when closing with a personal reflection that signals genuine engagement with the topic. Instead of saying, "So I think about this a lot," say this: "It is one of those questions that I find myself genuinely returning to, which is perhaps its own kind of answer." The fact that it resists easy resolution suggests it is asking something real, which is perhaps its own kind of answer, is a beautiful closing move. It reframes the absence of a conclusion as itself meaningful. Use it for genuinely difficult questions where intellectual honesty matters more than a neat answer. On to the final section, handling difficult questions. Some Part 3 questions are unexpected, abstract, or about topics you have not prepared for. These 10 phrases allow you to handle any question with composure, buying time, checking understanding, and recovering when your answer is not going as planned. Phrase 41. That is a question I find genuinely interesting. Let me think about it for just a moment. Use when, buying 3 to 4 seconds when you need time to gather your thoughts on an unexpected question. Instead of saying, I am not sure, say this. That is a question I find genuinely interesting. Let me think about it for just a moment. I think what I would say is, this is the single most important rescue phrase in part 3. It sounds natural, it buys time, and it signals genuine engagement rather than blankness. Practice it until it feels completely automatic. Phrase 42. I want to make sure I am answering the question you actually asked. Could you clarify what you mean by use when? When a question contains an ambiguous term and you want to answer the right question. Instead of saying, I do not understand the question, say this. I want to make sure I am answering the question you actually asked. Could you clarify what you mean by meaningful in this context? Because my answer would be quite different depending on how you define it. Asking for clarification signals intelligence rather than confusion. It shows the examiner that you have noticed an ambiguity that a less careful thinker would have ignored. Phrase 43. I am not sure I have a fully formed view on this, but thinking out loud, what I would say is, use when. When you genuinely do not have a prepared position on a topic. Instead of saying, I do not know, say this. I am not sure I have a fully formed view on this, but thinking out loud, what I would say is that the question seems to rest on an assumption I am not entirely convinced by. Thinking out loud signals that what follows is genuine rather than rehearsed. A fully formed view acknowledges intellectual honesty. This phrase transforms not knowing into a sophisticated performance of live thinking. Phrase 44. I think I need to distinguish between two different versions of that question. Use when. When a question conflates two distinct issues that require separate treatment. Instead of saying, it depends, say this. I think I need to distinguish between two different versions of that question. The short-term version, where I think the answer is probably no, and the long-term version, where I think it is considerably more complicated. Making a distinction is one of the most reliable analytical moves in Part 3. It demonstrates that you have identified a complexity the question did not acknowledge, which immediately elevates your answer above the level of most responses. Phrase 45. Actually, let me reconsider that. I think what I actually want to say is, use when you have started an answer in the wrong direction and want to correct course. Instead of saying, sorry, say this. Actually, let me reconsider that. I think what I actually want to say is not that the policy is wrong, but that the implementation has consistently failed to match the intention. Reconsidering mid-answer sounds like genuine thinking rather than a mistake. It models the kind of intellectual process, stating a position, finding it inadequate, revising it, that marks sophisticated analytical speech. Phrase 46. I find myself genuinely uncertain about this, which I think is worth saying honestly. Use when you are asked about something you do not have a clear view on. Instead of saying, I think both sides are right, say this. I find myself genuinely uncertain about this, which I think is worth saying honestly rather than performing a confidence I do not feel. What I would say with more certainty is, worth saying honestly rather than performing a confidence I do not feel is one of the most sophisticated phrases available in Part 3. It signals both intellectual honesty and self-awareness simultaneously. Phrase 47. I have not thought about this in quite these terms before, but working through it now, use when a question frames a familiar topic in an unfamiliar way. Instead of saying, I did not prepare this topic, say this. I have not thought about this in quite these terms before, but working through it now, I think the most interesting dimension is probably the one about long-term versus short-term consequences. Working through it now sounds like live analytical process. It transforms a lack of preparation into a demonstration of real-time thinking, which the examiner values highly because it reveals genuine fluency. Phrase 48. The question assumes something I am not entirely sure is true, which might be worth examining. Use when the question rests on a questionable premise. Instead of saying, I disagree with this question, say this. The question assumes that economic growth and environmental protection are necessarily in conflict, and I am not entirely sure that is true, which might be worth examining before I give an answer. Examining a questionable premise is a sophisticated analytical move. It is more respectful than saying the question is wrong, and it opens a richer discussion than simply answering the question as posed. Phrase 49. I think I can approach this from two different angles, and they lead to quite different conclusions. Use when. When a question has multiple valid analytical frameworks. Instead of saying, there are many ways to look at this, say this. I think I can approach this from two different angles, the economic one and the cultural one, and they lead to quite different conclusions, which is perhaps itself interesting. Two angles leading to different conclusions is more analytical than simply saying there are two sides. The observation that this is perhaps itself interesting signals that you have noticed something meaningful about the nature of the question. Phrase 50. What I can say with confidence is, even if I am less certain about the broader question, use when, anchoring your answer in what you do know when the broader question exceeds your certainty. Instead of saying, I am not sure, but I think, say this. What I can say with confidence is that the data on this is considerably more mixed than the mainstream debate suggests, even if I am less certain about what the right policy response should be. Distinguishing between what you know and what you are uncertain about is intellectually precise and demonstrates genuine familiarity with the limits of the evidence. It turns uncertainty into a display of analytical sophistication. With this, we come to an end of this video. None of these phrases need to be memorized as scripts. What you are developing through practice and repetition is a way of thinking in English that reaches for precision rather than approximation. That is what Band 8 is. Not impressive vocabulary, precise thinking expressed clearly. The free Band 8 phrase Bible in the description has 300 more phrases, organized by topic rather than function, so it works alongside this video rather than duplicating it. Download it today. See you in the next one.